Hey everyone, Tim Crawford with Avoa here, and I'm in Austin, Texas, in Texas Hill Country, here at the Zoho Day 2026 Analyst Conference. Thought I'd just take a few minutes and talk about what I experienced, kind of my takeaways from the conference, and some things that maybe you should be looking at too, as it pertains to Zoho. So, for those of you that may not be familiar with Zoho, 30-year-old organization, privately held. They are now up to just over 60 applications, ranging from workspace to service management. And now we're going to talk a little bit about ERP. It's essentially a platform that allows you to run your business on. Um, they're operating in 150 countries, based in India. They have now about 150 million users, and they've crossed over the million customer boundary. So really impressive stats for the company. Again, privately held, so I won't be able to go into some of the more sensitive aspects, but there were some takeaways from the conference that I thought were really interesting and useful to know. So number one is the message about enterprise. As many of you know, my focus is around enterprise. Zoho historically has been more of an SMB mid-market targeted solution, but they are definitely making the move in earnest into enterprise, and that was coming out pretty clearly here at the conference. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's showing up in different ways for Zoho. They have strong, solid growth. Again, I won't be able to go into the numbers, but suffice it to say, they're doing just fine. So, for those of you that might be looking at the company and going, okay, it's not a publicly traded company. We just want to make sure that if we're putting our eggs in the Zoho basket, that we're talking about a solid player. It is a solid player in terms of company dynamics. In terms of the different apps, I mentioned 60 apps. Workspace, still fastest growing app, which is pretty impressive to see. It's really interesting, especially considering there's Microsoft 365, Google Apps that are alongside in the same vein of productivity apps. So it's interesting to see Zoho making significant progress in an already crowded space. And one of the conversations that came up, and I was really tickled to kind of hear this, is they're talking about value. Quite often I hear customers that are talking again and again about cost. Cost. Is it too expensive? I need to find something that is lower cost. And unfortunately, they're not thinking about value. And why that's important is that value, the equation for that is essentially the opportunity or outcome minus the cost. And so you want to make sure that the value you get or the outcome you get is greater than what you're paying. But at the same time, I think folks are being maybe a little too flip on just looking at the cost and not thinking about what they're getting for that cost. So it was great to hear them tie value and tie it to outcomes. This was pretty unique. I don't hear a lot of companies today that in the vendor space that are talking about true business outcomes, and Zoho was, and so that was incredibly refreshing to hear and see. The second is I led a customer panel, and we were talking about enterprise. We were talking about some of the experiences that each of my panelists have had with Zoho. And one thing that was very interesting, we talked about the problems they were solving for. We talked about where Zoho came in, and then we had a third section where we talked about where they're going from here. And here's the interesting takeaway. In the first two sections, talking about the business problems that they were solving for, talking about where Zoho fit in, none of them mentioned AI. None of them. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting dynamic, because quite often it seems like you can't get away from any conversation without talking about AI. But these customers were very much focused on the business outcomes as opposed to the the technology itself, the underlying technology. And so that was really kind of refreshing to see. But let's be honest, AI was part of the conversation here at Zoho Day. One of the conversations in the public space right now is around AI versus SaaS, and Zoho being a SaaS play. It did come up in conversation. What was really good to see on the main stage was how Zoho is breaking it down so that customers understand that SaaS and AI are very different. And when you shift if you were to shift from a SaaS model to an AI model, what are the implications of that? And so, they talked about how you start moving the risk from the vendor to the customer, you start moving the control from the vendor to the customer, the maintenance. And many customers just aren't geared, they're not capable of taking this on. And that has not been part of the public conversation. There seems to be this one for one that AI can just simply replace SaaS. And there's so much more to it, which I won't go into in this video, but I'm going to be talking more about is why there are aspects of SaaS that AI can augment, but in terms of a replacement, AI is not replacing SaaS, especially in critical spaces like CRM, like service management, like ERP, finance systems. So we have to understand what the implications are and have an honest conversation about it. For Zoho, their agentic platform is built around Zia, which is their AI offering. What was great is they started talking about MCP and A2A. They're starting to explore A2A. MCP is starting to come out, so making the Zoho platform available to other platforms. So imagine if you're using a product externally and you want to tap into the Zoho Hive, if you will, you're going to be able to do that through MCP. There was some conversation around system of record, and this is again one of those conversations that, frankly, I was really impressed to see Zoho talking about, but I'm really glad that this is coming out in the public space, which is moving from system of record to system of intelligence and onward to system of experience. And so quite often we talk about system of record, but we don't necessarily think about system of intelligence or system of experience. And so Zoho was kind of articulating how they're thinking about it. It doesn't necessarily do away with the system of record, but rather it sets the context for it. And I'll get to a couple of reasons why in just a minute. I was having this conversation in an interview that I was doing yesterday. About every decade or so, there's this shift in the industry from best of breed to platform, and then back to best of breed and back to platform. And I've seen it happen several times over the course of my career. We're in that stage where there's this move away from best of breed and more toward platform. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I won't go into in this particular video. But Zoho was talking about that, and it kind of plays well for their platform. I mean, their platform is essentially a platform you can run your business on. And so that'll play well for them as we start to move from best of breed to the platform approach. Kind of in that vein, one of the things that they announced here was this concept of the App OS. And so Zoho, when you look at the layers of the architecture, it's pretty deep. And what App OS does is essentially collapses some of these layers into the platform, which then makes that available across the different applications. Now, they had that before, but there were some subordinate layers in the architecture. And so what they've started to do is think about how do they start to collapse those layers so that they can make it make the data more broadly available across the different applications, which then means you have consistency in the data and the experience for each of the applications. So that's a huge plus and takeaway. Zoho is also working on owning the stack. I was a little surprised to see this. I shouldn't be, but I was a little surprised to see this. They brought on stage a server that they have designed, so hardware server. This isn't something that a customer is going to necessarily use, but rather it's a server so that they can start to manipulate and optimize their platform all the way down to the hardware level. So they've designed their own system board, processors on it. They're looking more at general purpose processors as part of that. And so not looking at the latest and greatest GPUs, which is kind of interesting in its own right because that does change the price performance dynamics when you start to think about the whole value chain and the whole value stack that customers are going to end up paying for. And I mean, that's one of the things about Zoho is a relatively low cost solution for what you get. And they even fully admit, yes, they're leaving money on the table. And this gets back to kind of the core around the culture of Zoho. And I've talked about this in the past, but I mean, Zoho is a very unique company in the communities that they work in, and what they give back to those communities, much more than any other company that I've observed. It's really impressive. But getting back to the hardware, I think it's really interesting how they're thinking about kind of owning the entire stack from the data center all the way up. Kind of speaking along those lines, they have grown a lot in the last year. When I was at Zoho Day a year ago, they were making this very steady progress year over year over year. I mean, it was incredibly deliberate, and you could see it. You could see the progress in terms of the work they're doing, the number of offices they're opening, the number of data centers they're opening, and the revenue. You could see this consistency. It was very deliberate and kind of on a consistent clip. What's different this year is it's almost like they've started to take this uptick. There are more offices, quite a few more offices and data centers, so it seems. And so what that means is that they're really leaning into things like sovereignty. How do they start to address the increase in challenges that companies are facing around the globe? Because again, Zoho's in 150 countries. Each country has a unique set of requirements, whether it's in Asia Pac, ANZ, whether it's in EMEA, Central Europe, Africa, or across the US, and even LATAM and Brazil. So it was interesting to see kind of how they're growing and where they're growing. Impressive, though, very impressive. Again, they're on an uptick, and that was really kind of good to see. One of the things, as I mentioned kind of at the top of my remarks, was around ERP. And so they announced Zoho ERP, which is a collection of applications that essentially bring together your operations, your finance, HR together to provide that overall experience in running your business. They are starting to roll this out in India, and then we'll roll it out in other regions in short order. But they're definitely going to put a little bit of a target on their back from others that are trying to get into this space, not the ERP space, but for the vendors that are targeting SMB and maybe mid-market and moving into enterprise, and then those on the larger end of the scale that are trying to move down market. Zoho is definitely making inroads, and the overall theme in the conference was enterprise, enterprise, enterprise. Not to get rid of the SMB or not talk about SMB and mid-market. That's still their bread and butter. They're kind of core to that mission, but they are most definitely making some significant inroads. If only I could talk. Significant inroads into enterprise, and so that will be something, especially the ERP actions that they're taking coming up here. The other piece to that is they're going after specific verticals. Now, verticals can be kind of a touchy subject for some, but I like the way that Zoho is going about this. They're picking off verticals that, and it's only a handful of verticals to start, but they've already articulated another handful that they're currently evaluating. But they're picking verticals that they have deep experience in. So verticals that they have a lot of knowledge that they can then embed into the application and kind of what the customer sees. One that they were going through pretty deeply was talking about automotive and automotive systems and kind of how you go through the process and the different steps in running that business. And so I thought that was really interesting going after the vertical. So that'll be something I'll want to watch. One of the core messages is kind of wrap things up here on my summary notes, and I'll have more on this coming up in my write up. But one of the things that was a core message from customers, and I've been hearing this time and time again from CIOs, as well as those outside of the IT organization, and that is you have to clean up your data, especially as we move into an agentic world, an AI world. Our data has to be cleaner than ever. And time again, I keep hearing you've got to clean up the data. If there was one thing, one takeaway that people have experienced that they would want to do all over again, it would be clean up the data even more so before they made the move into a new platform or into a new application. So data is going to be something we're going to have to come back to. And kind of in the same vein, we're going to have to come back to governance. It was one area that at this Zoho day they were a little light on talking about was governance, which I was a little surprised to hear, or rather not hear about. But I do think as we go through time, we're going to have to talk about governance hand in hand. Whenever we talk about AI, we talk about governance. It can't be a bolt on, it can't be a separate conversation. It has to be part of the core conversation when we talk about data and we talk about artificial intelligence. All right, so let's wrap this up. So a couple of kind of key takeaways here. Number one, Zoho is focusing on business outcomes. When they talk about transformation, they make a distinction between digital transformation and business transformation. The fact that they recognize that and the fact that they're talking about business outcomes indicates to me that there is a significant maturing that's going on within Zoho. Number two is context. They talked a lot about this, which is not just understanding kind of the flatline statements around business, but understanding the context that goes with it. And that's going to be increasingly more important as we go through time and we start talking about how agentic systems work. We're going to need to understand the context of the data, not just the data itself. And then lastly, integration. One of the opportunities you have when you're working with a platform like Zoho is you have the inherent integration between the different applications, which is, frankly, it's really kind of a nice to have. You kind of take some of the fragility out of your architecture, and you can provide greater consistency across the applications. Zoho is thinking very deeply about how to increase the integration beyond what they already have and providing that context. And so the App OS announcement and collapsing of the layers is just one example of that. And then, of course, AI is going to come back into the mix at some point here. This conference wasn't heavily about AI, which frankly was refreshing. It was more about those outcomes, context, data, where customers are really finding value in Zoho, and then some of the strategic changes that Zoho's making that I just shared. So hopefully you got something out of that will be useful as you kind of think about where you go from here and the different products that you're evaluating. But that's it for now from Austin, and we'll talk soon. And look for a write-up on this in more detail in short order. And then some of these other concepts I'll be talking more about, writing more about in the coming days, weeks, and months. Hope you have a great day. Love to hear your thoughts as well. So definitely comment and share your perspective. I'm always open and welcome to those. So thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.